Into this teaching. So we are in this teaching on Adam Hamilton's book called Unafraid. And this week we're looking at, we're shifting gears. We looked at politics, terror, horrible things, and now we're shifting to more intrapersonal type fears. Stuff more in our inner world, what we deal with. And today, the question that we're talking about is, what if I fail? And it has to do with fear of failure. So that's what we're going to look at today. And on the next slide, this is the map of where we're going. Not too complicated. We're going to talk about Hamilton's 3 words of advice. We're going to talk about the failures we fear, because there are some gender-specific things that we fear, and we're different that way. And then we're going to talk about the character shift, an insight that I've been struggling with all week and had just a light bulb moment earlier in the week. So anyway, we'll get to that. Anybody ever struggle with the fear of failure in some way at all? Okay, apparently half of you are human and the rest we're not quite sure. If you're human, you fear failure on one level or another. And Hamilton gives very, very practical advice. In fact, what we've learned about this book is it is a great resource for very practical help on dealing with fear in general. There's great helps in the back. And in terms of managing your fears on a daily, kind of regular basis, he has really good advice. So on the next slide, we've got these 3 things that he says. Let me just walk you through them briefly. Not complicated, but if you've never heard it before, it's really helpful. The first thing he says to us, remember Adam Hamilton, first of all, he's got some years under his belt. He's somewhere in his upper 50s, maybe 60 now. So, he's not new to life. He's been through a lot. He's raised kids. Those kids are growing up and getting married. He's also a pastor. And pastor types, you may not think about what we do a lot, but we are with people from the very beginning to the very end. So when people are having babies and all that stuff, we're there in all those happy moments, but then also some crisis moments when things happen with children. And so I've been in some very tough valleys with people through that. And of course, I'm with people at the very end and everything in between. And so pastors have a different view on the world than your normal folk because of that. And so he's bringing some wisdom to the table here, and he's a very bright guy anyway. And the first thing he says is that things will likely never be as bad or hard as you fear. It's just not going to be as bad as you think it's going to be. Our typical human response to things is to catastrophize. So some bad thing's going to happen, and rather than just taking a step back, taking a deep breath and thinking it through, oh no, that's not what we do. We think of the absolute worst case scenario. So if this thing happened to me, well, it's going to domino effect into all these terrible things, and all of a sudden the world's going to fall apart. That generally isn't how it works out. So there are a few times where this has come in handy, and I learned kind of the hard way. Even though intellectually I knew this was true, I lived through it, and a lot of you lived through this too. Right about around 2008, there was this little thing that happened called the Great Recession. Are you familiar with that? And like overnight, our home value dropped several $100,000. And we're looking at that and thinking we're still paying a note on a house that is not anywhere near that, and we don't know if it ever will be again. And we, for a little brief period of time, catastrophized. At least I did. I don't know if Lynn did. I think she may have. She's thinking about it. She'll get back to us in a few moments. But I did. And I started to think, how's this going to play out? Because I was in a term mortgage at that time. I was like, what if this comes due and the house isn't at value? What are we going to do? And so I started to think about worst case scenarios. Panicked a little bit, ate some Rolaids. That was sort of helpful. But you know what I ended up doing is I just really started to think about what's the worst thing that could happen to me and my wife and my 2 kids. And I started to realize, okay, if we lose the house, what would we do? And I realized that it was very unlikely that we were going to be living on the streets. Although if we were in Napa, it's not a bad place to live on the streets. I know where to get the food, I know where to find shelter and all that. But most likely, we would find a welcome from friends or family for sure. Even if I lost my job because the economy was terrible and you couldn't afford to have a pastor anymore, all that stuff, the worst case scenario at the end of the day was going to be totally survivable. It was going to be a little sucky, just to be honest. I may use that word again. That's like a little worse than stinky. And it sort of, communicates something in a guttural level. But it wasn't going to be the end of us. And so just taking pause and realizing it's just not going to be the end of us, that gives us some peace of mind, and it helps us manage stuff. So if you're going through it right now, just realize that your tendency is to catastrophize, that it's going to be all bad, and the reality is probably not going to be as bad as you think. And even if it is horrible, in the grand way that we'll look at the end of this teaching, it's still going to be okay. It's going to be okay. The second thing is this, that successful people do, however you define success regarding whatever fear of failure that you're talking about, whatever that is. But, quote unquote, successful people do things unsuccessful people are unwilling to do. Adam Hamilton remembers a commercial of Michael Jordan back in the day when he was the Steph Curry, right? And it's this commercial about all of his failures on the basketball court. How many shots he missed, how many game-winning shots he missed and let the team down. On and on, huge numbers that he's sharing. He had no idea. But then the point of it was, the only reason he had that many numbers that were bad and failures was because he took a lot of shots. He took the risk. And there's a real truth in that with our lives. This whole idea of just showing up, the whole idea of just putting one foot in front of the other, keep moving forward, and not cowering in fear and shutting down, that's sage advice. Because a lot of us, we do shut down. And we play it so safe that we find out that we may actually be limiting our life by trying to remain so comfortable in our lives. That's a whole other thing to fear. What if you get to the end of your life and find out that you played it so safe that you never even experienced what life can be? That's kind of what he's getting at, is don't allow that to overcome your life that you've been given. And the final thing he talks about is discernment by nausea is often right. This is a little counter Christian rhetoric, by the way. I don't know how many Christians over the years I've heard when they're trying to make a decision, they say, well, I just feel a real peace about this, especially if it's a whopper shift in their life or whatever. You know what? Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you have this peace that passes understanding that Paul talks about. I'll talk more about that later, too. But sometimes it's actually the nausea that tells you that you're doing the right thing, that this is a whopper. And I started to think about this for myself. Is this true for me and my life and my journey? Have the nauseous moments, they're not necessarily nauseous, but definitely big butterflies, anxiety or whatever, have those been cues to me that actually the decision I was making ended up being right? And the answer is yes. You want to hear some of these whoppers? Where I decided to go to college, and actually going to college, where I decided to go to seminary, that's my master's degree to become a pastor. Our first church, where we decided to say yes to that. Moving my wife and my 2 babies, literally, to Napa, California, away from all family. Yep, lots of anxiety. Buying our first house, a 30-year commitment, at least on paper. A whopper. And the whopper, when I found out that my wife was pregnant, totally anxious. It's like, holy cow, what did we just get ourselves into? We're still not quite sure, so we'll let you know. Work in progress. But one also that surprised me, when it happened and has surprised me now talking about it, is the day before and the day of my marriage. Because Lynn, her character's kind of, not quite sure. It was a risk. Now, the crazy thing was I still love, but loved her. And so it's like, of course this is who I want to be with. And on paper, couldn't have, I did really well when I married Lynn, let me tell you. I mean, in every possible way, it was a step up for me, right? And it was a good thing. On paper, everything stacked up. I loved her. We get along great. So why was I nervous about it? Why was I nervous buying a first house? Kids, those are good things. Great opportunities for career and ministry. Why would I be nervous? Well, because they're huge decisions. And if you're not feeling anxious about really huge decisions that are going to affect big chunks of your life, well, maybe you ought to get counseling about that, because you should. But what would happen if we went by this idea that, oh, I just have to feel so at peace about every big decision I make? Well, you're not going to make very many big decisions. You're going to be on autopilot, and you're going to be on rails, and like I said, you're going to be at the end of your life, you're going to wonder, what happened to my life? Is that it? Life requires risk. Risk means you're risking failure. The question is how do we manage our fear along inevitable risks that might lead to failure? Brene Brown, she had a great line out of her book. I mentioned it in my blog. You've heard the quip, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? You ever heard that one before? And that sort of gets at your dreams, But she shifted it around. And she said, what is worth doing even if you fail? What is so important in your life that it's worth doing even if you fail? That's an important question that gets you to the heart of the matter. Now, so this chapter on Hamilton, so far it's been fun and games and good stuff, and it's been easy for me to think through, all right, I want to tie into this biblical story, but this one was difficult for me this week. And I kept chewing on it all through the week, and I hate it when I chew on it all through the week because that means I'm not done with it until late in the week, and I like to be done with it early in the week. So you're feeling my pain, right? And you know why this chapter was so hard for me to figure out what to say to you today? Because it's the one that's hit home the most. Fear of failure. You need to know something. That I love this church. I love it. I've earned some gray hair leading this church, more than my wife would like. Earned some wrinkles, earned some time. I love this place. I love who we are. I love who we're becoming. I love where we're going. I love what we are known for in the community. But I got to tell you that because men and their career and success in their career and all that is a real phenomenon, I struggle with fear of failure all the time, on a regular basis, with varying degrees of success. And guys, I think particularly deal with this because we are so closely identified with what we do for work. So closely is tied to our feeling about success, our feel of value as people. And the crazy thing is, as I was thinking about this week and processing it, is intellectually and in every way about what I'm really passionate about, my job, no offense, but my job, it's like a distant number 5 on my top priorities. 5. And it's way below 4. Because my relationship with God is number 1. My relationship with my wife is number 2. My relationship with my kids is number 3. My relationship with my family and my friends is number 4. And then somewhere after that comes my career, cognitively. So what is it? Well, if you're a guy, you know what I'm talking about, I think. Can I get an amen out there? You with me on that? Yeah, this is real stuff. And it's about your job, it's about how your work is going, and depending on who is in your ear, it may affect whether or not you feel like a failure or a success. Sometimes the measure is not so much your work itself, but what your work creates, the income that it creates. And so we look at our homes, and we look at the cars that we drive, and we look at the labels on our clothing and the watches that we wear, and all these things which say to the world, I have reached this level of success. I am not a failure. Here's the problem, though. This is true for women, but I think it's worse for men on this work connection and our stuff and identify, because our stuff identifies our successfulness in life. The problem with it is as we pursue that success, we don't really realize, except for very few moments in our life, that the game is rigged, that we will never actually feel successful. Because as soon as we get this thing, there's a commercial saying, oh, there's another this thing. That until you have that thing, you're not really there yet. Or, oh, you moved from this size of house on that street to a larger house on that other street. Hey, feel good about that, but not too long, because you really haven't reached it yet until you're there. It's always out of reach. And it doesn't matter how much money you have, how many properties you have. You talk to those people and get inside their head, it's never enough, because the game is rigged to make you think that way. That is our culture. That is what men deal with. Women do too, in different ways. I'll talk about that in a second. But men, we struggle with failure along these lines regularly. At least until we're retired, I think. In my morning thing yesterday, one guy was sharing and said, it's not about my job anymore because I'm not in my job anymore. Now it's fear of health. So we'll get to that in a few weeks. But for those of us who are working, who are identified by our work, we struggle with this. And if we tell you that we're not, we're either out of touch with what's really going on, or we're flat out lying. Because the game tells us this is how you're successful or you're a failure. Now let's talk about women. So women have a couple specific areas that men do a little bit, but not anywhere near to the same degree as women have. And one of those issues has to do with how you look. Let me just go on record saying, you look fantastic. Let's just get that out of the way, and it's true. But you may not believe it. There was a survey done, and it found out that 70% of men in the United States, when they get out of the shower and are drying off and look in the mirror, they say, looking good. Yeah, feeling great about how they look. The number drops to 40% for women. And I think that's high. I think that's high. Because our culture, and it changes generation to generation in its specificity, our culture says to women through our media, our advertising, all sorts of things, this is what perfection looks like. If you are a real, vibrant, sexy woman, this is the picture. And if you're not in that picture, failure. You may not think about that as failure, but that's what's going on. And who am I to tell you? Who am I to tell you that that's a thing? Talking to my daughter when she was in high school, finding out how many girls that are, barely are becoming women are so obsessed with weight, starving themselves. I mean, whatever it takes. It's like, you got to be kidding me. It's a real phenomenon. Do I even need to speak about that anymore? Isn't it crazy, too, that it depends on the generation? So if you took today's picture of absolute beauty and perfection, and you took her back a generation, and let's go further back. If you took her back a couple hundred years, you would be unmarriable. Because they would look at you and think, wow, no birthing hips there. Let me tell you. You need a little meat on your bones if you're going to, bear children or whatever. I don't know what they thought back in that day, but that was the picture. And you think about the women in our culture, just in America, from the 1950s. Think about Marilyn Monroe. I don't think Marilyn Monroe would make it as a model today. Not quite there. Crazy. The game is rigged for women, just when it comes to appearances. I got bad news for you. If you are taking your cue from the culture about this is what beauty and perfection looks like, you are never going to be satisfied, and you're always going to feel like you're failing more than you're succeeding, because it changes and shifts all the time. And you are changing and shifting all the time. Doesn't matter how much work you do or how much work you have done, it catches up to us. And we're no longer that 22-year-old that is the picture of whatever we're supposed to look like. So you deal with it. You deal with fear of failure. You deal with shame. You deal with it on all kinds of ways that men honestly have no idea about. I mean, you know, I do this, me and Oprah, we have this, we diet together because we overeat in the holidays, and then we have to work it off and all this stuff. So she and I, you know, we're like this. She doesn't know my name, of course, but we're tight. You know what? There have been times when I get to where I want to be, and Dar will tell me, hey, people wonder if you have cancer. I'm like, what? Or they'll come to me and they'll say, hey, you need to put on some weight, man. We're worried about you. Try saying that to a woman. Right? Different game, different variables, different standard. Oh, and let's go one step further, because there's a double bind when it comes to women that men know nothing about. We know nothing about this. Women, you need to look sexy. Important that you look sexy. Not all the time, not all the time. We're not going to tell you when you need to be sexy, but we don't want you to be sexy at the parent-teacher organization meeting, because that would be inappropriate. We don't want you to be sexy at church, because that seems weird. But a lot of the other times, we really want you to look sexy. I don't know how much, but we'll let you know if you miss the mark. Right? That's reality. Let's shift gears. This is another very gender-specific thing that men know nothing about. And today is the perfect day to talk about it, because issues revolving around motherhood are a massive double bind in our culture. So you don't have children? Why not? What's wrong with you? You don't want children? That's not natural. We have lots of communication that we hear and speak about women and children that never gets put to men. I've never heard, say like a late 20s, early 30s aged couple, I've never heard anybody go up to the husband and say, hey, when you guys going to have a baby? Your clock is ticking, man. Never happens. But women, yep, happens. It's not fair. It's not right. It's one of those fears of failing. And then, let's say you have a kid. And now that you've got this kid, you are in another double bind. So my wife graduated from college with a teaching degree, but her dream that I knew, and we've talked about it from day one, her dream was, if at all possible, she wanted to be at home with our kids when they were little and be involved in school and do all that. And we've been able to make that happen, which I'm very grateful for and very happy about, and she's very happy about it. However, if you were or are a stay-at-home mom, you know there's an interesting double bind at work. Because on the one hand, you have some people in culture that are applauding you for being a stay-at-home mom. Well done. From maybe an old-fashioned conservative kind of voice in our culture. And they're celebrating you. And yet there's another voice in culture that's saying something different. You have a degree. You're wasting your degree. You're letting our gender down. What are you doing all day? By the way, husband's really dangerous thing to say. Don't say that. All you need is one day of being the stay-at-home parent to find out you do a lot and you don't do much all at the same time, because you're so on the go and you have to be so attentive all the time. It's crazy. It's crazy. Men don't get that. I never had anybody come up to me at the birth of either child and say, hey, so are you gonna stay at home, or is Lynn? And actually, it was never even a, how long do you want to stay at home, Pete? It was actually an expectation. Well, how soon, how much time do you really need? That's different for women. Well, let's say you do it the other way. So let's say you're wired differently, and it wasn't the same kind of dream for your life as it was for my wife. And so you decide, have kids, but you're passionate about your career and you want to do that. So you figure out child care arrangements for your kid. Uh-oh, I can't believe you did that. Why did you even have kids if you're not going to raise them? And so this is a double bind. You can't win. As long as you are listening to that voice of what success and failure is about, you are going to have failure in front of you all the time. The game is rigged. Am I right? Yeah. So while Hamilton's stuff is helpful in managing it on kind of a regular basis, it doesn't drill down to the core. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. And I discovered through a light bulb moment this week, through an error that either I made or I did make because I didn't catch it, and some stuff that Bill Krim gave me for last week's exercise when I had you do that, answer a hot topic question, and then there's some process questions. And one of the questions would have been like, well, what emotions are you having as you heard this person and you're doing active listening stuff? And then there was another question that was on there that I think probably was exactly how Bill did it. So he had a typo that his spell check didn't catch. My spell check didn't catch it. My eyes didn't catch it. And the question was this. It was supposed to be, after hearing somebody give their opinion, are you scared? But it was misspelled. The character was one shift off. Because the question came out in your printed stuff, are you sacred? Are you scared? Or are you sacred? And I want to tell you, that really is the question. That really is the question. Because they go to two very different places. I can guarantee you from my own personal experience, I got to let you know, I continue to struggle, and it's something I manage, and I'll tell you how and what I'm learning as I'm growing in all of this stuff. But I'm telling you that the way our culture is rigged, the way the voices are, particularly in a consumer-driven culture where it is necessary that we continue to buy more and newer stuff, we're going to live with this scared mentality all the time. Fear of failing what we look like, fear of failing the criteria of success in every way. That's what it would mean to build your life, and it's miserable. And we find ourselves doing crazy stuff to continue and perpetuate that misery. But there is a sacredness that if we tie into that sacredness of who we are, it is the game changer. So on the next slide, we have a couple people speak. And the two rock stars in Christian history, in my opinion, Paul, who started all these new communities of faith around the Mesopotamian area, and then Jesus, who founded the whole thing. First, let's start with Paul. He said this profound thing. This is a guy who's had the snot beaten out of him, who eventually would be killed after a long time of being locked up. He says, I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. For I can do everything through Christ, who gives me strength. I tie two words together there, content and Christ. Paul learned what it was to build his life on the sacred and not the scared. He understood who he was, and let me tell you, it gave him great boldness in whatever he did and wherever he went. But it was not an easy choice. Jesus makes that very clear. So Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. It's not that God doesn't want people to find it. It's just that few people get there. Most people are on the comfy highway that leads to nowhere. But we're comfortable in the journey, even if it's leading to our own destruction. Jesus is saying there is a different way. There is a different way. There's a different way. I'm submitting to you that it is that sacred way that is not driven by the voices all around us saying this is what success looks like. But there is a different way that drills down to what God is actually whispering in our ear all the time about who we really are. And who we really are is sacred. You are sacred. You, because you have the breath of God in you, you're sacred. You, because you are created and formed in the image of God, and God said, very good, you are sacred. The rest of the world is going to tell you through myriad forms all the ways that you are not stacking up and how you're not quite meeting it, but the voice of God is saying this to you. You are a unique child of God. No standard of success can be put to you because there's no other you that has ever existed before. It is impossible for you to measure yourself solely on what everybody else is doing because they are not you. You are gifted and unique. You are one of a kind. You are special. You are rare. Start living out of that. Because when you start living out of who you are at your depth, you're unshakable. You are unshakable. Because that cannot be shaken. So, how successful am I in doing that? Speaking of failure, you know what makes the difference for me? It depends who I'm allowing to whisper into my ears. If I'm just with me and Jesus and Paul, I feel so good about Crosswalk because I think we're following in the footsteps of Jesus and Paul. We're known for being a graceful church. We're known for serving the community in this place. I love that. But when I start to listen to other voices even from church world that have been so enculturized, if that's a word, where everything must be bigger and better, I get incredibly discouraged. And so do most pastors in this country. Because it'll never be big enough, never vibrant enough, never flashy enough, whatever. Because the culture has adopted for churches itself what success looks like. Sometimes they are successful. Sometimes, who knows? But I do know the pressure created from that cultural lens is on every single pastor like me. And if not checked, this is happening, by the way, in our country. You have no idea how many pastors struggle with depression because they're listening to the scared and not the sacred. Now, when I think about, and this isn't about me, this is about us, but when I choose to focus as much as I can on what the Spirit of God is saying to me, who I am, who I'm called to be, then all of a sudden I remember that Jesus had a mega church for about 5 minutes. And it was on a beautiful open air stadium kind of environment. And thousands of people flocked to hear everything this Jesus had to say until Jesus says, there's fine print. If you really want to do this sacred thing, it's going to mean you pick up your cross and you follow me. And they all left. Because cross-carrying doesn't fit with the cultural message of it's all about me, it's all about more. When the cross is all about sacrifice for others. Wide is the path that leads to destruction, to misery, Narrow is the path that leads to life. Few find it because it doesn't look like life at the outset. I think about Paul. I'm trying to think about how many massive churches that he had. Oh, none. Because he was constantly starting communities of faith all over the place. Thinking about how many healthy congregations were at play not long after he was there. Not many. Because they all struggled, because we struggle with this thing. My question is, how about you? How about the fear of failure that you have? If you're a guy, your competency, your identification with your work and your stuff and all that stuff, where are you getting your cue? And for women, yours is tougher than men, I think. Because you have all the men's stuff that's coming along as equality is becoming more reality, which is a good thing. But then you have all the baggage of creation up until now. What's your fear? Are you living scared or are you living sacred? Which center are you living out of? There's one hopeful thing. Hamilton does bring this up in his chapter, and I'm going to tell you that this only works if you're centered in the sacred, at least as an experiential reality, and not so much if you're trying to live out of a cultural scared center, but kind of calling yourself Christian at the same time. That's a very, very difficult place to be. But on the next slide, we get this passage from Paul to a very broken church that was messing things up, and the people that were really messing it up, they didn't want to change. They wanted things to stay the same, which meant that Christianity was going to be an exclusively Jewish thing, and we weren't going to let non-Jewish people around the table. And it was causing lots of problems, and they were being very nasty about it. So Paul wrote the book of Romans into that mess. He hadn't even met them yet. And he says, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Now, this is used very flippantly by a lot of people who make terrible decisions, who don't want to own the consequences of their decisions. And they do these things, they say, well, I totally screwed that one up, but God works together for all good, blah, 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 blah. And happy go they go. I don't think that's the core thing. I think we have the Apostle Paul here, who did the best he could with his life to live responsive to the Spirit of God, and did the kinds of things he did because he sensed that's what God was calling him to be as the person Paul was created to be. In other words, I think he was trying to stay in step with God as much as possible, but sometimes it hits the fan, especially because we go where God wants us to go. And things fall apart because we're doing it right. And at that point, Paul just says, we just got to trust God with this thing. We're doing everything we know to do, to be healthy, to be whole, to be honoring the voice and the will of God. And sometimes that's going to get serious backlash, and then we just got to trust. God understands it, and God, as some master weaver, is just going to somehow take even this ugly stuff in our lives that maybe we had no control over whatsoever, and somehow, some way, particularly if we live out of the sacred space, something beautiful is going to happen out of here. Even the horrible things of our lives. It doesn't excuse the horrors that we face or the horrors of history. But what it does say is that God is that big, that even these horrible things, God is able to take these ashes and do something beautiful. He's able to take our mourning and give us gladness. He's able to take our weakness and give us strength. But we don't really experientially live that when we're rooted in the scared. We do live that the more we live in the sacred. My question for you is simple. Which center are you living out of? A scared center. That you're like a wind-tossed boat on rough seas. Never quite sure if you're going to make it. That's scared. Or is your core? How are you identifying with the fact that you are sacred children of God? And allowing that to do its work in every possible way, because that's where life is. I hope you'll choose sacred. I hope you'll choose to live, because that's what you were created for. Fear not. Let's pray together. So God, as we close our time together this morning, I pray that we will be very honest with ourselves about what we're really afraid of, what we really fear, and I hope we'll take it the next level and really drill down just to find out how severely our fears have shaped our reality, our vision, our hope, our actions. Because until we do, we are probably blind to just how much life we've missed out on because we've been living scared. You call us to something so much more grand and beautiful. To a person, you do this. And it begins by identifying ourselves with Christ, with the anointing of God. Identifying ourselves as sacred, loved by you, created by you, strengthened, supported by you. So if we have never even thought of that, then today, God, I hope we will. If we've never said out loud, that's what I want, then maybe today you will finally come to and say, God, I want to be your child. I want to live as your child in all the splendor you've created me to be. I want to choose the sacred. I want to choose the narrow way that leads to life. May it be so, God. And for those of us who've been struggling all our lives, even though we've been trying to walk with you, may it also be so that we would choose anew to be founded in the sacredness of who you've created us to be. And because of that, may we find ourselves unafraid, willing to move forward even when great risk is causing us to have serious nausea. May we know you're with us. May we know that at the end of the day, because we're in you and this whole thing's in your hands, it's going to be okay. Be with us, God. Help us. In Jesus' name, amen.